Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Thank you for the shower of love responding to the last hour of the programme. It is appreciated. And yes, it is incredible to present a phone-in programme on which people are able to change their minds live on air, myself included, although not in that hour. Possibly in this one. I don't know if you follow my colleague Rachel Venables on Twitter. You should. She's been attending or following Theresa May, who's in a sixth form, talking about her university skills. The lad sitting next to her was asked what he was going to do at university. He just turned to her and said, theoretical physics. She went, oh gosh, theoretical physics? I don't know whether that's vocational or not. Do you? Is it? I mean, what do you do with theoretical physics? You become a theoretical physicist. But we're all theoretical physicists. Oh, theoretically, I could be a physicist. Is that not what theoretical physics is? It's vocational if you could become a physics teacher. Is it vocational? Because if it's theoretical, it's not practical. If it's not practical, how can it be a job? You still with me at the back? Should we talk about philosophy instead? At 11:30, I have to tell you, Alex Renton will be joining me in the studio. Alex is a journalist whose work I have followed for many years. I've only met him once. He's written a book that will break your heart. It ties in a little with the conversation we were having in the last hour. And he's now made a film about a continuing conspiracy of silence regarding sexual abuse at top British boarding schools. I don't want to labour the point, but obviously if it was sexual abuse that had been undertaken by brown people, it'd be in your newspapers every day. But given that it's undertaken by people ostensibly part of or friendly with the establishment, the cover-up and collusion continues. I really want you to stick around for that. That's why I'm giving you a quick heads up now. And there's another story in the news that I've got a massive problem with, because it highlights my kind of tarnished feminism. You can't change who you are overnight, right? It's incremental. I was trying to make a list the other day of the things that we've changed our minds on as a society that we would once have passionately argued about. And you should begin with the silly stuff, like seatbelts. I remember when compulsory seatbelts came in. I didn't have a job like this at the time, but people were furious. Look at abortion. I know abortion is still a controversial topic, but the idea that a woman shouldn't have the right to decide what happens to... I shouldn't have gone down this road. You're going to bombard my tweet now. But it is nowhere near the same type of debate that it was when I was conceived in a country that considered my conception to be so sinful, but a termination of that pregnancy to have been even worse, that a teenage girl from Ireland had to cross to the mainland in secret and pretend that she was at college for a year while giving birth to me. The world changes in enormously profound ways without us really noticing sometimes. The smoking ban, do you remember that? You remember when people were still bloviating and banging on about the smoking ban as if it was the end of civilization as we know it? Now I can't quite believe, on the rare occasions that I find myself in a smoke-filled room, when you wake up the next morning and go to put your clothes in the laundry, go put your clothes in the washing machine, I can't quite believe that when I was a teenager, the smell on my clothes after a very, very rare evening in a smoke-filled room was normal. God knows what we were doing. You remember the ceilings in pubs? I thought you could only put yellow paint up in pubs. I thought it was a rule. It was like Del Boy riding up and down the country with gallons and gallons of pale yellow paint that every pub in the land had to be painted with. It's amazing what changes. What other stuff have we got? I guess tuition fees. I don't sense among young people the massive objection to tuition fees that was common in 2008 when the Labour government introduced them, or that became even more weaponised and politicised in 2010 when Nick Clegg's pledge to abolish them was abandoned as part of his signing up to the coalition government. Votes for women. You really want to reach for a biggie? It's only 100 years ago, and there were people passionately opposed to that. You know, property rights for women, slavery. I mean, the fact that we sometimes feel we can't change, it's palpably absurd. But I increasingly realise as I get older that people like me have a habit of demanding change yesterday and getting very cross and impatient and even perhaps intolerant of people who refuse to change or who can't see change. Do you know what the breakthrough moment for me was? Equal marriage. And I think it's because I go to church. And I'd started going back to church a lot around the time that equal marriage became a very big issue. And obviously, the idea that you can't get married because you're gay is absurd to me and quite offensive. Although back when I was being educated by Benedictine monks, it's the kind of thing I might have argued in the debating society in defence of. It's all about environment and context, isn't it? But what I suddenly realised was that I think I've got this right. What I suddenly realised was that if you've been sitting in church for 30 or 40 years, or for indeed more, for 5, 6, 7 decades, and you have believed or you have been taught that marriage is only for men and women. Marriage can only be between a man and a woman. You have been taught that. You have believed that. And then suddenly you've been told to abandon that belief. Suddenly you've been told not only that you have to change that view, but that what you've believed for years is wrong. I can see why that would be offensive. It changed the nature we handled that debate. I think you have to accept that perhaps, you're turning around an oil tanker, but you're not going to turn around an oil tanker by marching around with big sticks and smacking anybody over the back of the head who still wants the oil tanker to carry on in the opposite direction. This is what I think people mean by the intolerant left. And they have a very good point. They have a very strong point. But of course, ultimately and eventually, you will come up against the people who still believe that they should be able to, poison their children by smoking wherever and whenever they want. They still believe that they should be able to drive around without strapping their children into the back of the car. They still believe that they should be free to do all of these. They still believe that women shouldn't have a vote. But you can't treat everybody with a changeable mind in the same way that you will eventually and ultimately have to treat the bigoted people who can never change their minds. So equal marriage was a big one for me, and it was a moment when I sort of thought this whole notion of progressiveness, or this notion of progress, openness, whatever it may be, it's not unassailable. You have to acknowledge its problems. And if you're turning around, because it happens now that I'm in my second half of my 40s, I sometimes feel that I'm being told I'm wrong. Trans issues I struggle with. I'm trying to get better at it, and I make mistakes, and then I correct my mistakes and I go back. But you're turning around to me and telling me everything I've always known. I've always just sort of presumed that there are two genders, two sexes, and that they are more or less the same thing. I'm learning that that's not the case. But it's a really difficult thing to learn, and I still struggle with it. Feminism, the idea, for example, that we still ask women whether they're likely to get pregnant when we're interviewing them. My gut reaction is to say that's fine. If I'm thinking of hiring you, then I want to know whether you're likely to hit the road in 6 months' time, because I'm going to spend the next 6 months training you up. But I also know that that's sexist. I also know that plenty of countries in the world have managed to prove that the world won't end if you introduce legislation to make sure that you can't discriminate against people for the possibility of becoming pregnant. I can see that social change is on the horizon, but personally, I can't yet join in. We might talk about that in the next hour. Do you see what I mean? Look, gun laws in America eventually will have to change. I think the younger generation, the Florida experience recently seems to be a sea change. Kids are just going to stop going to school or whatever it may be. But it's going to take ages and ages and ages. And that's fine. But let's keep having open conversations about stuff. Let's keep having minds that are changeable. Let's keep recognizing that just because people are struggling with the process and pace of change doesn't mean that they're utterly impenetrable and immune to the necessity of change eventually. I can't remember why I went down that road. I'm sure it was for a very fascinating reason. What I really want to talk to you about is university education. And the question of change here is one that I can't yet accept. And I don't know that I will trust Theresa May's motives for doing it. But she's going to suggest today that university as the best option for all school leavers is an outdated attitude. She will, I don't know if she used the word snobbery, but she will challenge snobbery around skills training, criticise the notion that technical courses are for other people's children. And I don't know who she's talking to. I don't know whether she's right or wrong, but I don't know who she's talking to. It seems to me that we are on the brink of a very dangerous period in British history where we are denigrating intelligence. We are despising expertise. We are condemning culture. You see it a lot. It's a peculiarly Anglo-Saxon thing, you know, this notion of lovey being an insult, this notion of university education being undesirable. It seems to me to be the biggest available key for unlocking horizons denied to you by your birth. If you're born, and remember, my background is really complicated because I often wonder what my life would have been like if I hadn't been adopted by the best mum and dad on the planet and sent to one of the best schools in the world. Who would I be? What would I be? I'd still be me, but in many ways I wouldn't be me. And education is the key. Education is what sets you free. So when a very middle-class daughter of a vicar, a very conservative prime minister, suggests that there's something snobbish about telling people that they should go to university, here's what I worry. I worry about who she's talking to, because I don't think she's talking to middle-class conservative voters. I don't think she's saying your children shouldn't go to university. I don't think she's saying your kids shouldn't be reaching for the stars intellectually, shouldn't be trying to accrue as much knowledge as is humanly possible. I don't think she's saying your kids might be really good mechanics. I don't think she's saying your kids might be really good theoretical physicists. No, but vocational. Do you see what I mean? But I wonder whether my politics are blinding me a little bit on this one as well, and whether actually it's right to suggest, as the world changes, that our attitude to a university education needs to change. I'd like to know what you think. Middle-class conservative voters, call me now and tell me whether or not you agree with Theresa May that your children shouldn't go to university, or is it just possible that she's doing something a little bit more sinister? And what she's really doing is appealing to this white working-class constituency that we hear a lot about, and she's essentially telling them to know their place. Because when I look at the detail and the statistics that examines why white working-class boys in particular perform so poorly at school, I don't start wringing my hands or feeling confused or reaching for mystery hour. I know why white working-class boys are failing at school. It's because they're being taught at home, they're being taught by the media, they're being taught by their parents' political heroes, they're being taught almost everywhere they go that education is for saps, that the country has had enough of experts, that people who like books are lovies and lefties and liberals. And that's why they're doing rubbish at school, because of the cultural inculcation that is being inflicted upon them by their so-called betters. And how do their mum and dads treat their so-called betters? Tug forelock, doff cap, vote Rees-Mogg. 0345 6060 973. I think I'm barking up the wrong tree. I'd like to believe Theresa May's motives are pure when she suggests that too many people are going to university. But I've got two problems with it. Number one, she's been in the cabinet for the last 8 years and in charge of it for most of the last 2, and she's announced a review into higher education policies that essentially date back to 2010. How's it going to take her a year to remember what happened in cabinets she attended? And number two, when she says that university isn't the best option for all school leavers, I just don't think she means children like middle-class conservative voters' children. I think she means somebody else's children. But I am hopefully wrong. John's in Norfolk. John, that's a bit broad. Whereabouts in Norfolk? See what I did there?
I'm actually in Heacham.
Oh, okay, yeah. So near the Broads?
Yeah, no, opposite side, Wash.
All right, well, that went well. Carry on.
Yeah, anyway, right. I think that I'm not a Theresa May supporter in any way at all, but I think that she could well be onto something. Now, I worked on and off in Germany for 15 years, and if you look at the way that the Germans bring young people through to successful careers, university is only a relatively small part of it, so maybe 20, 25%, something like that. The majority of people with their hires, their equivalent to A-levels, go through into engineering or manufacturing or pharmaceutical or industrial.
So is this statistically sound? Does Scotland have a better record than we do?
Germany.
I beg your pardon. Germany have a much demonstrably superior kind of record on this thing than we do.
Absolutely, social mobility is much better.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Good.
You know, and you know, and also. Well, it's funny. It also ties into Brexit, but we won't go there. But the
if you want, mate.
Well, no. I mean, I'm certainly not a Brexiteer, having worked in Germany and worked in Holland and worked in Italy.
You could barely. I've got heaps of in my sites now. You could barely drive a mile in your part of the country without seeing a Vote Leave poster back in the day.
Oh, I know.
Absolutely everywhere you went.
I have to keep your mouth shut in the pub. I tell you.
I tell you what happened to me in Wells Next to the Sea. Bloke in red cords when I asked him what was going to happen in Ireland. And the Irish, don't you worry about that, old boy, we'll be absolutely fine. So I'm terribly sorry. Could we possibly just have a little chat about it? I just wonder if you've got any idea whatsoever. Oh, no, nothing to see here. Anyway, we digress. Carry on.
Yeah, we do. Right, yeah. So, people come through, and it's a sort of tripartite sort of like arrangement where there's tax breaks to private companies to bring people through, and that's why, because they've got an economy with such manufacturing, sort of all the car manufacturing.
Yeah, but we haven't.
No, this is true, but maybe we're going to. This is the time to Brexit. We're going to have to do something in terms of.
Just as we withdraw from the largest market in the world, we're going to become a massive manufacturing behemoth.
No. I mean, leaving the largest market in the world is bloody ridiculous. Sorry, yeah? but
you brought my cough back.
We're going to have to sort of like. Maybe she is actually, you've got to remember, she's not really a Brexiteer. Maybe she is actually thinking herself, we've got to rebalance this economy if we've got any chance of being successtul.
Yeah.
And one of the ways of doing that is through, let's face it, how many kids go to university, do completely useless degrees and end up working behind a bar?
Loads. I don't know how many end up behind a bar. I don't know what a completely useless degree is as I get older.
Okay. Education is worthwhile, full stop. Yeah? Absolutely. And you could argue, if you go back to the more purist days of the 70s, I'm not quite that old, but if you go back to those days when people did pure academic degrees, you could argue that we had a more educated population, so you had a generally more civilised country, I suppose. Yeah?
In some ways.
In some ways. But, there are an awful lot of degrees out there with people are getting like big debts and they're getting degrees which really aren't giving them any access
and give me then
anything significant.
Because I'm a bit thick on this in terms of ignorant. I think I'm bright enough to understand it when it's explained to me, but I don't have the vocabulary yet. What are the kind of things that you file under vocational training?
Okay, I worked primarily for a company that did LED lighting for aircraft interiors, runways, glazing for cockpits, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Architectural glazing. So it does tend to be around non-service, yeah, because they have a very strong.
And what would we do instead? So here is someone thinking of going off to do a degree in media studies or babby washing, as my late dad always used to call it, and you step in and say no.
Well, it's your job. It's LBC's job to partly fund those people through a proper internship.
Yeah, no, well, that's that. No, I get that side of it. I'm trying to get the other side of it. So you now come along and say, no, don't do that. You're wasting your time. Come over here, and we will do what? Instead of going to university to do a degree that is unlikely to open any doors for you specifically, come over here with me on the LED lighting side of things, and we will do this. What will replace the current situation?
Well, basically, what you've kind of created is a market, an internal education market, where they'll go and talk to a university, and the university will say to them, sort of like, these are the degree courses we have on offer. They will ask questions about what are the outcomes and things like that.
Yeah.
They'll also go and see half a dozen companies at the same time. They won't only, when Germans, when they get to sort of like that age, and the Dutch are the same, they don't just go to the university, they go to a few universities, they go to a few companies, and they talk to companies, and they talk to their coaches at school, their careers coaches, and they decide whether university is the best route for them, or whether through an internships route for them. But equally, it's actually not even that simple, because you can flip-flop between the two. You can go, if you went into doing a technical degree, you could start it with a manufacturing company and then go into university for a year, or you could go into university.
So you like this?
The
thing is, it's about whether or not she's acting in good faith, because, the bursary take-up, I think, has gone down since the last policy was brought in. But you want a funding system, you need business. This is where I sound a little bit pessimistic. Businesses that don't currently exist on anything like the scale that they would have to would take up some of the slack currently being employed by universities. They bring people in and show them a future. But you see, then we're back to Germany, mate, which exports 5 times more to China than we do. So it's a manufacturing powerhouse. Where are these young people going to go in Britain?
Well, I mean, this is a game where the investment...
Yeah.
I mean, if we're
Chicken
going to
egg.
leave... It is, but also, again, I personally think, and this is going to sound controversial,
Go
but
on.
and I'm a great supporter of the NHS, but in a way, almost forget the NHS. All this £350 million a week stuff is sort of like, you know, right, at the moment, the biggest thing that threatens us is the fact that we need to reshape our economic model to be competitive outside the EU, which is something we should never have done in the first place. But that is the situation that we are in.
And the people that have done it can never admit that we should never have done it. But
so the money that should be sort of that we pay to the EU every year should be ring-fenced for economic regeneration, new technologies, tidal power,
all the stuff that would have been subsidised by the EU historically.
Yeah, basically. But
happy days. No, I get it. I think I get it, and I like the idea that this is nuanced. This isn't good or bad.
You said Scotland, you know, instead of Germany, and that's an interesting idea because if you look at some of the SNP policy there, the SNP policy was very much that look, if we invest money, we can generate all our own energy from tidal systems, and let's face it, they've got plenty of it. Yeah? Yes. And at the same time, not only have we sort of like solved our own issue, we've created a new manufacturing base to export to the rest of the world.
And you know, I did an event with the Scottish Government recently involving environmental issues and learnt so much. The two big takeaways for me being, number one, that they see economic intervention as being a profit making operation.
So the Germans.
And we haven't quite got there yet. And the second thing I took away at the end, I asked the audience, put your hands up if you think that the Scottish Government has a better handle. It was an audience full of industry and environmental experts. So, you know, the fellas from Toyota with them making the electric cars right through to the people trying to get rid of them. Do you know what a nurdle is, John?
A nurdle?
Yeah.
No,
nurdles are big in the environment world, mate. You're ever going to chair a panel on the environment, you need to find out what a nurdle is. So, and then you've got the nurdle manufacturers, and they're there as well. And so put your hand up if you think Westminster is better than Holyrood on these issues. Not one hand went up. And if you think Scotland is better, Holyrood is better than Westminster, every hand in the room went up.
Well, there you go.
And before you go, a bit of Norfolk banter?
Me? No, I've only been lived in here for a while.
Oh. But Heacham is where you've got that caravan park with the weird parade of almost homemade houses out the back of it.
That's right.
Yeah. What's that about?
Yeah. Well, they're just sort of like seaside homes.
But people don't live in them. But some of them literally look like they've been bolted together with Meccano.
Yeah, and you're only supposed to live in them for 10 months a year.
Is that the deal? That was the bit that we couldn't understand. We went there in a gale, so there weren't really many locals around to ask.
Some of them are virtual. Some of them have actually just effectively just become.
Some of them are quite smart. Some of them look like you know, they give shantytowns a bad name. And you, just because I don't know why I feel the need to endorse my Norfolk credentials. You're it's just the lavender place right near you.
That's right.
Yeah, I got it now.
Yeah.
All right,
I mean, my mum and dad lived up here for 30 years, and I've just sort of like done a little mini grand designs on a place. And,
get you. You've been to the Duck Inn in Stanhope yet?
Oh yeah.
Oh, now that's worth moving to Norfolk for alone.
Well, you got a few. You got the lifeboat. That's nice.
See.
Anyway,
the hero. I like the hero.
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah. See. I've just re-established my Alan Partridge credentials. Thank you for your help, John. Joined now by Alex Renton, a journalist and now filmmaker as well as author. His film Boarding School's The Secret Shame Exposure goes out tonight on ITV at 10:45. And we've met before, Alex, and regular listeners to this programme will be familiar both with your work and with my interest in it. Because I went to these kind of schools and my friends were abused, and only relatively recently have any of them begun to see justice. Would it surprise you if I said I was surprised by your latest work? I thought that the traffic was moving in the other direction, and yet what you have discovered in the film that is broadcast tonight and the article in yesterday's Sunday Times is that collusion and cover-up are still commonplace?
Yeah, utterly shocked. And I think, you know, for all of us who had appalling experiences and have come out about them back in the day when we were at school, it's really, really shocking to find that this very complacent industry, which tells you again and again that was then and this is now, are actually experiencing a really high level of criminal assaults on the children in their care.
Still. And when you add to that the kind of sense of what I guess we'd call reputational protection, so that some of these institutions aren't taking historical responsibility for things that went on in the past. You're left with a sense that nothing's really got better at all?
Yes, I mean, the issue about not taking responsibility is really important, because the one thing that survivors need more than money is acknowledgement of their pain and some sort of apology. And what we found with the schools that we've targeted in the film, which had egregious cases of cover-up, is that, and many others, is that they'll issue nice messages of sympathy, but they say that wasn't us. We've changed our status, so we can't pay you.
Do they have any point at all? I mean, in terms of compensation, I can see that this is complicated, but they... Let me tell you about my prep school, which was owned by the headmaster, and the co-headmaster, who, looking back, must have also had a stake in it, is now in jail for sexually abusing some friends of mine. And no one's mentioned compensation, but of course compensation it's more than money, isn't it? It's an acknowledgement, it's a tangible measure of wrongdoing and remorse.
Yes.
But it's now owned by completely different people.
Yeah. And the same's happened with mine. I mean, they Ashdown House,
yes.
which, huge range of accusations and possibly more criminal cases to come, where they said we became a charity. We're awfully sorry, but this isn't us. And strangely, found that they can't find out who insured the school before, in that period, which you'd have thought was pretty obvious. And the thing, so I think it's more than just the acknowledgement and the therapeutic value of that to victims. It's also that if the school's insurers realise that the schools are taking shortcuts and liberties with children's safety, then it's the insurers who will police the schools really well. So we need to make sure that happens as well.
It's also, not for the first time, an examination of how these things happen in the first place. In many ways, you're looking at the aftermath and the failure to change the culture, but you began, and your book addresses how these things go on. And collusion is a strange word, isn't it? But I remember parents looking back who would have been encouraged not to make a fuss. That's the kind of thing we're talking about as well.
Yes, I've used
because it would have been bad for the victims to be the boy who was known to have been.
All sorts of reasons can be piled up, and for me, in some ways, they're quite similar to why a woman assaulted in Hollywood decides not to make a fuss, because to protect herself and protect her career and save embarrassment, and also the fear of not being believed. But it is dreadfully true. I mean, in my own school, I mean, I was, as I've told you before, abused by a violent teacher. Yes. When I was 8 years old. My mother did make a complaint, but she was hushed up by the school. And the teacher, we've discovered in the programme, was left very shortly afterwards, presumably with a ticking off, but was allowed to go on and teach at 2 more schools afterwards. And that's not I say this is systematic, because that's not the only case from our school.
No.
And so again and again, these very grand men in charge of these very grand institutions, they were mainly men,
yes.
Who could have stopped decades sometimes of abuse of children, failed to do so.
Because they didn't think it was such a big deal?
That's where it gets really odd.
And it's also, there's a degree of moral relativism here, because clearly things were not as understood or as reviled as they are these days.
Yeah.
You wouldn't have a big red alarm bell to hit in the way that you would hope, and I know the film finds in some ways that isn't the case as we'd hope, but people didn't think... I mean, I've mentioned to you before, I know a fellow who was abused by the Christian Brothers in Ireland and insists to this day that there was no harm at all, just a bit of a fiddle, and you'd get, as in your case, you'd get a fruit gum at the end of it or something like that. And I don't believe him. I think it's done him untold harm. He's got issues with promiscuity. He's got issues with...
But that goes deep into survivor's psychology.
Yes.
I mean, as a small child undergoing that sort of trauma, and the added trauma of being abandoned by your parents in these places, you have to normalise it to find something you can live with. And for some, that was saying, well, I was fiddled with, I was raped, but it did me no harm. Indeed, it made me the tough guy I am now. Yeah. And that's, because that'll play out in really bad ways.
Of course it will.
Later on, psychologically in life. That makes you weep.
It's really post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, it's like men who never mention their wartime experiences, but spent the next 30 or 40 years being horrible to their family who they loved. And hating themselves, you imagine. There's a lot of that there.
So many cases of that, it's very clear. Which is why this new atmosphere, and it goes on with what's going it's in chimes with what's going on elsewhere in the culture of coming up, confronting what happened to you, asking for redress is healthy. This is making, I hope, a lot of people happier in the long term.
Let's have just a little listen to some of your own testimony in tonight's film. Something that so about 2014 you first started to really address this and explain it and...
Yes, I realised I had to tackle it because other kids from my school were coming forward and seeking going to the police, and I realised I had evidence that would support what they were saying about the school.
So this is a clip from Boarding School's The Secret Shame that will be broadcast at 11:45, 10:45 on ITV tonight.
I remember very clearly the physical feeling of being pressed up against his sort of hairy tweed jacket while he had an arm around me and his other hand was going straight down the front of my corduroy shorts. And I remember quite distinctly being given the fruit gum afterwards, which I knew already was what you got if you submitted to this. But he was a very violent man, so I'm not sure what submission meant. I don't think you could have said no. Sorry. Okay, I just compose myself a little bit. It's funny how it's, however many times you tell it, it doesn't really go.
I've told you this before, Alex Renton, when I took a call from West Midlands Police a few years ago, shortly after my dad had died, and I presumed in the first case that's what it was about. I thought he'd sort of left his car somewhere, and it wasn't. It was because someone had done what you did and found the strength to come forward. And as I was speaking to the police officer, I remember as I walked across Waterloo Bridge, and she talked to me about boys, and I realised that these were men in their 40s, and she was seeing little boys sitting in front of her, and that's what people who watch the film tonight will see in that clip.
Yeah.
You just go back to being that 8-year-old boy, don't you?
Yes, and many of the people who write to me about their experiences, which is a wonderful thing, talk about becoming two people. The strong man who's not, or strong woman who's not harmed, can go forward and live a good life, and the little person they left behind, and their need to get back in touch, reconnect with that. And I think psychologically, again, that's really interesting, and an indication of deep, deep trauma.
Yes, and ongoing trauma, although your advice, presumably, to anybody listening to this who's suffered similarly would be that talking about it and getting it out there is always going to improve.
Yeah, shed a light.
The situation. I'm joined until 12 o'clock by Alex Renton, the author, journalist, filmmaker, and a man responsible for tonight's film on ITV. Boarding School's The Secret Shame. We could talk for days and not get close to concluding a subject such as this one, but we'll move on after the break to the very troubling, and even for someone who keeps a close eye on these matters, a very surprising discovery in the course of his latest work that in many ways it's still going on. Not just the cover-ups of what did go on, but the continuing conduct in the context of a country that really likes to congratulate itself on a regular basis for caring a lot more about these things than it used to. It's 11:45, joined for another 10 minutes, and we have a lot to squeeze in by Alex Renton, whose film Boarding School's The Secret Shame is broadcast on ITV tonight. Let's move quickly, Alex, if we may, to the modern day, to the investigations that you've undertaken into stuff that we would like to have described as historic, turning out to be nothing of the sort.
No, well, that's right. I mean, the ITN researchers on this film put a fantastic amount of work in and went to every police force in Britain. And we found these amazing figures. We asked them how many, since 2012, how many reports of sexual attacks inside boarding schools they'd had, and it was 425. Huge number, and from that 160 people have been charged so far, 30 ongoing investigations, and this is in an industry that says, I quote, it's almost impossible that the things that happened to you, to me and to your school friends could happen today.
And why doesn't that get reported more, do you think? Because the latest one from my prep school in Worcestershire, a school called Winterfold, that didn't make the national newspapers at all. And I don't have brilliant news sense, as any of my former colleagues from the newspapers will attest. I thought it would, and they don't. They don't get the coverage that, for example, a Muslim taxi driver in Rochdale would get.
Absolutely, and the science teacher from my school who was convicted last April, virtually no press coverage at all. And that's very disappointing for victims, because they need that. I think there's two things going on, and both of them are worrying. One is that we know that some of the powerful schools are getting court orders to make sure they're not named.
Actual injunction type?
Injunction, yeah, they're called Section 39 orders. So that means school parents and...
How can that be allowed?
Because their argument is that this risks identifying the child victims. But often, this is something that happened years on, and of course that doesn't even get into Ofsted reports. So a parent might find it very hard to know that the school's had a recent problem.
Right.
And the other issue is just straight intimidation of the media. I have to tell you that I was booked to appear on a BBC talk show just before I came on here, and they cancelled a few hours ago, saying that their lawyers were very worried that if we repeated the stats I just told you, then schools who hadn't had sex abuse attacks could sue, which is... Yeah, it sounds absurd, but that's a level of the fear that's there in the media about attacking these, or even reporting these powerful institutions.
Which are money machines as well, increasingly.
Well, they call themselves charities, but they don't do very much that's charitable that I can see.
I'm going to take a call from Malcolm, because he rang in pretty much as soon as he heard your name mentioned, long before you arrived in the studio. I'm not entirely sure what he has to tell us, but I'm as keen to hear it as you are. Malcolm is in Hemel Hempstead. Malcolm, good morning.
Good morning, James. Good morning, Alex.
What's on your mind, mate?
I was doing all right, actually, until you played Alex's clip just now, so I've had to make a few notes so I don't ramble. You're 100% right. Insurers will be the people who eventually regulate this, because the people involved for years have given safe reference to a dismissed teacher, and they've just moved on to the next school, and this spiral continues. Now, for many years, even after... I saw my abuser sent down for 21 years, and very kindly he managed to die in prison after only 6 years of it. But when he was sent down, I kept on asking the question of why was this allowed to happen, and how come nothing was done to stop it, and it wasn't until I read the book Stiff Upper Lip did I start to almost shout at the book, because it was almost like a direct facsimile of everything and more rolled into one of what happened at our small little school up in Norfolk. And these things, it's not a blueprint. They get passed from person to person, and they start a new school, and other teachers bring their own bits to it. And for as long as you've got rules such as do not talk, do not tell, do not mention to your parents, when your parents are then conditioned that unfortunately your son may have mixed with people who aren't as honest as your child and may now be telling the most wild tales, please tell us. Going back to school was actually more traumatic, because you wondered who was going to get it next for having informed on what happened at the school. Now, this was back in the 70s and 80s. But that culture, until it actually becomes checked and inspected to the same degree as all other schools, you've got to go to the grassroots. You've got to change it at the point of inspection, the point of audit, because these schools are a huge financial cash cow. They're not going to let anything get in the way of that till ringing.
What made you come forward, Malcolm?
Strangely enough, it wasn't until I'm sat in a room looking at my sons at the time, who were, 6 and 7, about the age when I was sent to school. And I kept on thinking, these lads are the same age as I was. And throughout my entire adult life, and that was a good 30 years, I never stopped looking for him, and I never stopped asking the question. But even during all the times when we did report it, and back then they even did an inspection, but the things that needed to be inspected weren't. And even as an adult, when I came forward, there was an initial reluctance the first time and then the second time. But fortunately, when we came forward again in 2009, attitudes seemed to have changed a little bit. And our trial was actually made very easy, because our headmaster had kept records on all 300 pupils, A to Z, in filing cabinets in his room, in his house, under an assumed name, and it was almost word for word verbatim what everybody had said.
Oh, my God.
And if we hadn't have come forward, this guy would still have access to children today.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's done. But hearing Alex's clip just now, it kind of shook me. And my wife read this book about 3 years ago and said one day you should read it, but not yet because you're not ready.
Oh.
But it's Alex, bravo, mate. Just keep going, yeah.
Well, thanks, Malcolm, and well done you for coming forward, and well done you for not sending your own children to boarding school.
Well, I had a massive off with my parents. I had a massive off with my parents about it because there was rest her soul now, but my mother passed me a little flyer for this boarding school, and I think I said something along the lines of I didn't have children to pass the parenting on to a stranger and then criticise the end result.
Yeah. You've got to be careful with that one, haven't you?
well, even then I made a comment about, you know, nothing will have changed. It will still be,
you know,
a hothouse for perverts. And she turned around and she said, "Oh, not that again." And even our parents, were conditioned to the. I would go as far as saying our parents were selected for their, I wouldn't say gullible, but
pliability,
manipulated. Yeah, and once, yeah.
And to an extent, you know, there's lots of parents that, you know, have so many accounts who did collude. I mean, they colluded in you know, they believed their children needed to be miserable to become good citizens. So I believe that.
Hence the title of your book, Stiff Upper Lip. Yeah. I mean, it's part of that thing. I'll just tell you something, Malcolm, because I think it will resonate with you as it did with me, and I've just mentioned it to Alex. When I was listening, because I was off last week, I had the radio on a lot, and I was listening to coverage of that Barry Burnell case, the football coach who the judge described as having undertaken abuse on an industrial scale. And I think the first man to come forward, years previously, his mum had said to him, "If anything like that had ever happened to you, son, I don't think I could cope." And it was 6 days after he died that he finally walked. 6 days after she died that he finally walked into the police station. It's everything's so tied up, isn't it, with everything else?
My medical records even show it as late as early as 1978. I'm admitted to hospital. I've had a tooth smashed out because I wouldn't do what I was asked to do. I've got numerous notes in the medical records. Even the headmaster's wife at my next school states they had a review and they said that this child is damaged and needs help. They wrote to the previous head who came back and said this child is out of control and only responds to the strictest of disciplines. So there's nothing like being sent to go and fetch your brand new cane from the room upstairs.
Oh, yeah.
And then bring it down to the classroom. So, no, James, I didn't send my children to a private school. And they, funnily enough, turned out just fine.
Yeah. I remember that being sent to get the cane ritual. You made a really important point, Malcolm. It wasn't... The teachers were not legally obliged to report an accusation of abuse outside the school.
This is mandatory reporting.
Yeah, they weren't legally obliged to do it when you were at school, when I was at school. They are still not legally obliged to do it now. So whistleblowers have no protection, and children are still... The law does not protect them and ensure that they're heard.
Talk us through briefly. Malcolm, thank you, mate. I'm glad that you've ended up in a better place. It sounds as if your wife has played a part in that as well. Because my friend Tom Perry is passionate on mandatory reporting as well. What exactly is it? Because it appeared, the first time I tackled it, it appeared that even some of the big children's charities didn't really understand.
Yes, Tom's in our film tonight.
Yes.
Mandatory reporting is this basic principle that you are legally obliged, if there's an accusation of abuse of a child in a protected, in care or in any sort of institution that looks after children, you're legally obliged to tell an officer in the local authority, so someone outside can take a view of the case. It works in Australia, it works in lots of European countries. Tragically, we've been told here by the police and the NSPCC that there would be such a deluge of complaints if it was introduced that the system couldn't cope. So they're saying protecting children properly in this way is too expensive.
I mean, that's your analysis.
Well, that's my analysis, yeah. But it's a resources issue, and the government has been consulting on it since 2016, still with no result. We have to have it if we're going to be serious about protecting children. Because
otherwise it gets... I mean, there's the commercial interest, there's the self-interest, there's the reputational interest to sweep it under the carpet and pass the problem along to someone else. Yeah, sometimes overseas as well. We've been following a case involving one of my old schools where a teacher has ended up in a school on the other side of the world, and that is the best example of out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah, that's a classic. Can no longer work in the UK, actually barred, and then go off to do it in Africa, in British-style boarding schools often. But no, there's a very clear change to the law, and we need it. Otherwise, things aren't in essence, different from when you were at school or I was at school.
Alex Renton, there is always a well, as long as I've got one, you will have a space at the microphone in this studio. You know that. Boarding School's The Secret Shame is broadcast tonight at 11:15 on ITV. Alex's book, Stiff Upper Lip, is in... it's available in wherever all good books are available, and you should probably dig out yesterday's Sunday Times as well. Thank you.
Thanks.
An awful lot of people touched in an awful lot of ways by that conversation with Alex Renton. I would recommend it. And it does tie in with everything we talk about increasingly on this programme. Increasingly baffled by it, actually. If you're listening to the first hour, why anyone would think that people would be slow to criticise Brendan Cox facing all sorts of unpleasant allegations and accusations. Well, the answer is, of course, that people do judge these sort of behaviours differently according to who has done them, not what they have done. So I find it unbelievable that these countless cases of abuse in private schools, boarding schools, football coaches, wherever it may be, don't get anything like the coverage that people like you and me feel that they should get. It's not either or. You know, go to town on the grooming gangs in the north of England, but go to town on stories like the ones Alex was sharing with us a moment ago as well. It's yeah, anyway, I'll keep saying it until everybody agrees with me, and it will happen eventually. 6 minutes after 12 is the time. 2 topics in the next hour. We'll have a little bit more on the question of university policies and trying to work out exactly what it is Theresa May is up to. I would say, having spoken to 2 or 3 callers on this subject already, I think it's fair to say all of whom better informed than me on the issue, that this seems to be broadly welcome. The idea that teaching young people that university is the be-all and end-all of tertiary education is unhelpful. The problem is, and this is, have you noticed how often this is happening on the programme at the moment? So we just don't know what life is like anywhere else. You don't know what the German model is when people hit the age of 18 and they've completed their hires, what vistas open up for them. All you know is what happens, in my case, in England. I'm pretty ignorant about the differences between Scottish and Welsh university, or indeed health. It's remarkable how blinkered we've become. Maybe we always were. But it seems that Theresa May is toying with the idea of making the education system more streamlined. And I have a sort of lazy political response, which could be best typified as thinking that she's telling other people's children that they should go on technical courses, and the children of your middle-class Conservative voter will still go on to university. I think that's probably a little unfair, possibly even a little lazy. But what do you think? Well, Theresa May says today, you don't need to go to university. I've got 2 questions. Number 1, is she right? Number 2, who's she talking to? Who are... I mean, is it people that I went to school with who were... let's say below 50%, academically speaking? We didn't really have academic streaming at my school. So if you were in the bottom half of the year, you probably shouldn't have been going to university. But if your parents were paying 30, 40, 50 grand a year to send you to a school like mine, in modern money, then they wouldn't send you unless you were going to get them into university. And some of those lads, I mean, not perhaps the bottom 50%, they haven't ended up as GPs, but they've ended up... Do you see what I mean? Who is she talking to? 0345 606 0973 is the number you need. And then we'll have a look at, I think, the strange story about pregnancy in the workplace, women being asked at interviews about baby plans. A majority of employers still think it's acceptable to ask a woman personal family planning questions during a job interview. And I'm a bit behind the curve on this one. It's the kind of story that gets me into trouble with Mrs. O'Brien, because I can see that in an ideal world they wouldn't do that. But I think at the moment I lean more towards the, yeah, all right, Rome wasn't built in a day, guys. I appreciate we should be moving towards a world where employers don't think it's acceptable to ask a woman personal family planning questions during a job interview. But I completely understand why they do. James is in Munich, in, those of you who haven't got a degree in geography, in Germany. James, what would you like to say?
Good morning. I guess I kind of come to this from a new sort of middle-class Tory voter.
Yes.
My background, I was the first person in my family to go to university, although through a number of sort of family tragedies and things like that, at the very beginning of my school career, during primary school, I was kind of certainly streamed towards the lower end.
Yes.
Through a brilliant comprehensive school where talent was was sort of encouraged, and there was an opportunity to grow, I ended up being the first person, as I say, for my family to go to university, and graduated from Cambridge about 10 years ago now. In the meantime, I've now moved to Germany, have my business here, and all of these sort of opportunities that are fundamentally middle-class pursuits of study, of working in sort of financial services and that type of thing. Fundamentally, it's difficult to see, with the greatest sort of vocational training system in the world, how that could ever be achievable.
The journey you've been on, you mean?
Exactly.
Because you would have been told fairly early on to know your place, so to speak.
Well, if we sort of look back, I mean, it was when we look back at sort of the original stance of May on education, with sort of bring back grammar schools, bring back academic streaming. The reality is, I wouldn't have passed that 11+. I wouldn't have got to a grammar school, and I come from Lincolnshire, so we still have them.
Yes.
So that was, I was told back then, don't try to do the 11+. You won't pass it in any case. So looking at sort of May's entire approach, it's sort of, look at the people that start with privilege and build on that. And then, we'll probably have to find something nice to say to people to whom that doesn't apply, in the hope that they should vote for us in any case.
So you're closer to my cynical interpretation of this than the previous callers were.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is there are sort of... there's quite a lot about May that's quite disquieting in that sense. She does have a lot of policies that sort of protect her very comfortable sort of status quo. She's certainly not a politician that you can say she actually stands for something or that she cares about people.
It's funny, we did a show about 18 months ago asking what Theresa May stands for, and I got the usual cavalcade of criticism, and then about 3 or 4 months ago,
basically for Theresa May as Prime Minister.
Yes, exactly.
If I can say that,
you can.
It's not. I mean, I don't support Jeremy Corbyn,
no.
but it's difficult not to sort of to not claim that he supports people, that he cares about people, and that there's a fundamental ideology to his view.
He may lack all competence to deliver anything to them. That's up for debate. But the idea that you can point to who he cares about, what he cares about, I agree with you. With her, she cares about the just about managing, and then she enacts policies weeks later that appear to squeeze them still further.
She basically cares about anything that will keep her comfortably in as Prime Minister. The only reason she called the general election was because she was so convinced that she would win.
But you'd never vote for Jeremy Corbyn, would you?
Never,
no.
Never. I mean,
this is the problem, isn't it, with British politics? You don't like Theresa May, so you must be a Hugo Chavez fan.
Well, this is the huge issue, because when it came to sort of voting in the last election, I was sort of hearing a lot of policy coming from May that I fundamentally disliked. I mean, it's a lot of it is a fundamental attack on social mobility, and for someone that, as I say, I'm from Lincolnshire, so Margaret Thatcher isn't so far away from my own ideology myself. It's quite difficult, because you look at May and you think, well, I'll vote for a Conservative Prime Minister that is then arguing for interventionist policy that Ed Miliband was slammed at the last election for. On the other side, I also then end up sort of faced with Corbyn as an alternative, who is even further away from that sort of...
yes. Oh, what a time. What a tangled web we weave. Are you going to stay in Munich after Brexit, James?
I don't know whether I'll be allowed to, but I'd like to.
Oh, Lord. That was supposed to be a light-hearted farewell, my friend. No, this is sort of apocalyptic sayonara. Wiedersehen, 12:14. Thank you.